I'm going to take up sort of where Steve has left off and talk about the way that Christians understood, the followers of Jesus, understood the Jerusalem temple. To begin with, and Steve's already mentioned this, we have to think about the way the temple, the role the temple plays in the story of Jesus' life, which is found mostly in the Gospels. And so it's wonderful because you'll see this in the exhibition next door. I'm going to be talking about art that really stops in the 6th century and isn't going to go as late as this. But in terms of how Christians read their texts later and how they understand the story through the story of the temple. And so the beginning of Luke, you have the story of the Annunciation to Zechariah, the birth of John the Baptist. And it's important because Zechariah receives this Annunciation because he is a priest in the temple, and he's on duty. He's in his what do we call it, Steve? His priestly rotation, maybe. And he receives this, as a priest in the temple, Annunciation that he will have a son. And so much of Christian art throughout the history shows, as we see next door, Zechariah as in the imagination of the Christian artist. What does a priest look like in a temple? And then we have the story of Jesus' presentation in the temple, according to the purification mentioned in Leviticus and also in Exodus. The baby and his mother have to come to the temple for their purification. And we have that great feast in the Christian tradition, the purification, also known as Candlemas, for those of you who are good Catholics, in February. 40 days from the birth. The baby is brought to the temple, and it's where they meet the prophetess Anna and Simeon, who speak of who Jesus is as a baby. These are all Luke. Luke is our gospel that tells the story of Jesus' childhood. We don't have any parallels to this. The story of Jesus and the elders when his mother loses him, his father loses him. They're there for the high holy days and they lose the child. And he says, didn't you know that I must be in my father's house? And so he's there teaching the rabbis and teaching the elders in the temple. When Jesus is older and after his baptism, the temple appears again in the temptation story. Jesus is shown, and actually Satan brings him up to the pinnacle of the temple and dares him to jump off to show that God will catch him. He doesn't do that. Don't tempt God. But that we do get much Christian art through the whole history of Christian art of this story, the pinnacle of the temple being shown. Jesus also teaches and heals in the temple. These end up in a much Christian art throughout the history. And what maybe is more interesting and important for our conversation today, Jesus, of course, predicts the temple's destruction in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which is why biblical scholars date Matthew and Luke after 70, because they knew it would happen. So they give that to Jesus in the text. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. The other place, a very small detail, but it turns up in Christian art quite often, is that Judas receives his 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus and then has second thoughts and tries to return the bribe, and he brings it to the temple. And finally, the very dramatic tearing of the temple veil at the crucifixion. So you have these stories of the temple embedded in the story of Jesus. And so much Christian art is then going to set the temple in the way that Christians imagine it to look. Of course, Christian art, and I should say a little bit about this because it came up and we'll probably come back to that. Our earliest Christian art really dates from the beginning of the 3rd century. And we don't have a lot of that art until we really begin into the late 3rd and the 4th century. And so I don't have a lot of things that really even I can show you that are contemporary to really early Christian texts. But I'm going to show you quickly some of these, and we may want to think about them later. This is actually 430, so it's relatively late. And it's an image, I think, not everybody thinks so, but I think of Zechariah receiving the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist. And you see, Zechariah is not dressed like we might think a Jewish priest would be dressed. He's dressed an awful lot like a Roman priest might be dressed. And he's at a gabled building, somewhat like a Roman temple would look. Now, this is quite a long time after 70. Nobody remembers in Rome what the Jewish temple would have looked like. And it has, notice, 2 towers and even a cross. This is very important to keep in mind. That, of course, Zechariah, who is now a Christian saint, would be at a church and not at a temple. So they put a cross on top of the temple. In the beautiful Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, this is much easier to show you now than you could actually see it in person. Around 432, a beautiful mosaic was put up around the arch of this building dedicated to Mary, shortly after she was declared the Mother of God at the Council of Ephesus in 431. And we have a series of images. You'll see more of these. And this one actually shows the presentation of Jesus in the temple. It may be our earliest depiction of the presentation of Jesus in the temple. And you can see that so-called portico of Solomon is presented as a kind of colonnade. And we have Mary and maybe Joseph here with an archangel. It's interesting because these figures are very controversial. Who are these men? Maybe they are representing the 12 tribes. The woman just cut off at the left here, holding the baby, is also a kind of controversial figure. She may be, in fact, Sarah, the millionth great-grandmother of Jesus as a kind of godmother, presenting the child in the temple. But over on the right, we see an image of the temple. There's some doves outside of it, coming, maybe offering themselves for sacrifice. The eternal lamp is hanging in the door. There are curtains. And we have that gabled roof again. It's golden. And actually, that's the Annunciation to Joseph on the very far right here. It's a mouse to work. But I want you to pay attention to what's in this pediment right up here. Is an image that's very hard to figure out. Now, it's a seated figure. And there seem to be 2 little heads on either side of it. And it's a very typical way of representing the goddess Roma, or perhaps Jupiter. It's also, though, because of the 2 little heads, possibly a figure of Christ enthroned. So the way the Christians are already imagining this temple is as a place that would have had Christ in the pediment with Peter and Paul on either side. So already we're seeing some interesting transitioning. In the imagination, of course it would be like that. This is a beautiful but very small little ivory in the British Museum. And we have the image of Jesus on the right talking to the elders at 12 from the Gospel of Luke. On the left is Jesus' baptism. I'm not going to say a lot about that because that's a sort of different story. It's not taking place in the temple. It's actually John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. And you notice, just footnote, since I've done a lot of work on baptism, this is Jesus as a little nude boy. Quite interesting. But there he is at age 12. And one of the things that you might want to notice here are this little flight of steps and that seem to have no particular place to go. We also, at these wooden doors that I showed you in the first place, there was the image of Zechariah's Annunciation. In the same set of doors, which is on the Basilica of Santa Sabina in Rome, very small little wooden panels, but they're very precious and rare. At the very top is Jesus also healing the man born blind, which in one story took place in the temple. And so we have almost the identical kind of structure, a gabled building with 2 columns, with tiled roof, that we saw in Santa Maria Maggiore, just about the same time. And one more time. In quite a bit later, around 530 maybe, this very small mosaic, which is a series of mosaics, the stories of Jesus' life and passion, There's a detail of Judas returning his little sack of money to the temple, maybe to Caiaphas in this case, to this funny little double-columned, gabled roof, dressed stone walled, almost just like a little tiny temple, a small building. Now, the temple also, as Steve has mentioned it, but I want to say a little bit about this, appears much more kind of prominently, I think, even in the story of Mary. And the Mary story isn't in the Gospels, it isn't in the New Testament, it's in an apocryphal text called the Proto-Evangelion, or the Proto-Gospel of James, and it's dated to the 2nd century, very early. And here's where these stories about Mary appear. I don't know how many Roman Catholics I've got here in the audience, so I don't know how much I need to explain this, but let me run through it pretty fast, because if you haven't heard these before, you're probably going to be surprised. But Mary, of course, the Immaculate Conception, her mother conceived Mary miraculously. So Mary herself is an Immaculate Conception, just like Jesus is a virginal conception. And at 3 years old, she's given to the temple. Mary and Joachim, Anna and Joachim, Mary's parents, because they had this great miracle child. She was also born to a barren mother. Realize that at 3 they need to dedicate the girl to the temple, which is of course something that doesn't happen in Judaism, but that doesn't matter. It's now the 2nd century Christians are telling their own sets of stories. And she's put into the temple, and she arrives and she stands at the 3rd step and she dances for joy to be in her father's house. And she's actually at age 12 presenting a difficulty because she's reached puberty. And so she will pollute the temple if she's allowed to remain, so she has to be quickly betrothed. And she's betrothed to Joseph in the temple, and there's the story of how they're going to figure out which one is her husband to be, and he's an old man and his staff bursts into bloom and so forth. She's also allowed, while she's waiting to be married, to be one of the virgins who spins the temple veil. And she draws lots for the colors of yarns that she'll get, and she gets the red and the purple yarn. And so very often, I'm going to come back to that, we'll see these images of Mary spinning. And of course, part of the red and the purple is she's spinning together the passion and the royalty of her own son. And whenever you spin or weave in narratives, at least in these narratives, you're gestating a baby. It's a parallel idea. When she's found to be pregnant, oh my gosh, she's broken all the rules, and so is Joseph. They slept together before they got married. So they have to go back to the temple and have a test, and they're given water to drink that's got some kind of special properties. It's called bitter water, and if they survive, then they're innocent, and if they die, then they were guilty, and they do survive. And this series of stories that take place around the temple begin to appear very quickly in Christian art.